When the dust finally settled, only one patch of vibrant green remained in a valley of dead things. Its survival was entirely due to Adrian's unthinkable strategy, breeding the pests instead of fighting them. While his neighbors had frantically drowned their own soil in poison in a vain attempt to repel the swarm, Adrian had opened his doors to it. The same people who had dismissed him as an utter lunatic were left staring at his thriving crops. The bell above the door at Holden's Feed and Seed didn't chime. It clacked, a dull metallic thud that announced Adrian's arrival like a dropped wrench. The smell hit him immediately, a dry, throat-coating cocktail of fertilizer dust, leather, and cheap Robusta coffee burning on a hot plate. Adrian wiped his boots on the mat, though it was a useless gesture. The mud on his Red Wings wasn't just surface dirt, it was baked into the leather, a permanent crust of compost, manure, and clay. He walked toward the counter, keeping his eyes on the scuffed linoleum. "Well, if it ain't the Lord of the Flies," a voice boomed from the corner. Adrian's jaw tightened. He didn't need to look up to know it was Greg Miller. Greg was leaning against a pallet of Roundup, holding a styrofoam cup, his boots pristine, and his denim jacket unstained. Greg farmed 3,000 acres of corn and soy on the flat side of the valley. He drove a tractor that steered itself via satellite. Adrian looked at Greg. "Morning, Greg." His voice was gravelly, unused. "Come for more of your witch's brew?" Greg snickered, looking over at Tom, the store owner, who offered a polite, strained smile. "What is it this week, Artie? Fermented bat spit? Ground up ladybug wings?" Adrian didn't smile. He set a plastic jug on the counter. "Just 50 pounds of kelp meal, Tom, and a gallon of blackstrap molasses." Tom punched the keys on the register. "You got it, Adrian." "Put it on the tab?" "Cash," Adrian said. He dug into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled wad of 20s. He hated the tab. The tab meant they owned him. He smoothed the bills on the scratched glass of the counter. His hands were a map of abuse calluses, thick as bark, dirt permanently embedded beneath split fingernails, a fresh red scrape across his knuckles from where the combine's belt had snapped yesterday. "You know," Greg said, pushing off the pallet and sauntering over, "I drove past your lower 40 yesterday. Looks like a damn jungle, Art. Weeds, waist high. I saw wild mustard, thistle, and bugs. My God, the bugs." I rolled my window up. "You're breeding a liability over there." "They aren't weeds," Adrian said, the words heavy and tired. He'd had this conversation 100 times. "It's cover crop, buckwheat, and clover. It fixes the nitrogen, gives the predators a place to breed." Greg let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Predators. Listen to yourself. You're running a petting zoo for insects. The co-op inspector was out at my place Tuesday. Said if your aphids cross the property line, he's going to mandate a spray. I'm not letting your hippie science experiment ruin my yield." Adrian took his change. The coins felt greasy. "My bugs stay on my side, Greg. They got plenty to eat." He picked up the heavy sack of kelp meal, throwing it over his shoulder with a grunt, and grabbed the molasses. He didn't look back as he pushed through the door. Outside, the late June heat was a physical weight. The air was thick, shimmering above the asphalt. Adrian threw the supplies into the bed of his rusted Ford, the metal searing hot against his palm. He climbed into the cab, pumping the gas pedal twice before turning the key. The engine coughed, rattled, and finally caught, spitting a cloud of blue smoke. As he drove out of town, the landscape shifted. Greg's fields stretched out on the left, endless, perfect rows of neon green. The earth beneath Greg's corn was powder dry, a bleached, lifeless beige, stripped of everything but the synthetic chemicals keeping the stalks upright. It looked like a military cemetery. Perfect, sterile, dead. Then Adrian crossed the creek bridge, and his own land appeared. It looked a mess. He knew it did. To the untrained eye, it was a derelict farm. Between the rows of his heirloom tomatoes and peppers, wild grasses grew. Sunflowers drooped under their own weight at the borders. The air here didn't smell like dust and ammonia. It smelled like rot, like damp, decaying leaves, sharp and earthy. It smelled alive, and right now, Adrian hated it. He parked by the barn, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute, the steering wheel digging into his stomach. His head throbbed. He was 38, but his knees felt 60. He looked at the bank envelope, sitting unopened on the dashboard. He didn't need to open it to know what it said. 2 missed payments. The margin was gone. He was risking his grandfather's land on dirt and bugs. A cold spike of doubt drove itself into his chest. Maybe Greg was right. Maybe he was just an idiot, too stubborn to admit he was failing. He rubbed his face, his rough hands scratching against a 3-day stubble, the scent of the kelp meal clinging to his skin. "Screw it," he muttered to the empty cab. He grabbed the molasses and got to work. The brew tank sat behind the barn, a massive, retrofitted plastic water tote hooked up to an industrial aquarium pump. When Adrian popped the lid, the stench was physical, a sweet, sour, deep earth funk that made his eyes water. It was compost tea, water, worm castings, fish emulsion, and now the blackstrap molasses to feed the bacteria. He poured the thick tar-like syrup into the bubbling brown water. The pump hummed, aerating the mixture, turning it into a frothy, living soup. Tomorrow he would spray this over the leaves of his crops, coating them in microscopic armor. Adrian wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm. The sun was directly overhead, beating down on his neck. He grabbed a hand trowel and walked out into the field. The noise was the first thing you noticed. While Greg's fields were silent, save for the wind rustling the dry stalks, Adrian's fields buzzed. It was a chaotic, low-level electric hum. Flies, bees, gnats, wasps. As he walked down the row of Roma tomatoes, a cloud of cabbage moths scattered. He knelt in the dirt. It wasn't the dusty powder of the neighboring farms. Adrian dug his bare hands in. The top layer was a thick mulch of chopped straw and dead clover. Beneath that, the soil was dark, almost black. It held its shape when squeezed. It was cool. He cracked a clump of earth in half. Dozens of tiny, translucent white threads stretched across the gap mycorrhizal fungi. He saw a fat purple earthworm writhe away from the light, retreating into the damp dark. Adrian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The dirt was right. But the plants. He stood up and examined a tomato leaf. It was peppered with tiny yellow dots. Aphids. He flipped the leaf over. A cluster of them, pale green and bloated, were sucking the sap from the vein. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of his throat. He had a lot of aphids, too many. If they multiplied any faster, they would stunt the plants. The yield would drop. If the yield dropped, the bank would take the tractor. Then the land. He reached for his radio instinctively, a phantom urge to call the co-op and order a tank of permethrin. Just nuke them. Kill the aphids, save the crop, survive the year. It would be so easy. Just hook up the sprayer, put on a mask, and wipe the slate clean. He stared at the leaf. His thumb hovered over the radio on his belt. Then, a tiny movement caught his eye. A speck of bright orange landed on the edge of the leaf. A ladybug. But it wasn't just the ladybug. Adrian squinted. Moving erratically along the stem was something that looked like a tiny, aggressive alligator. It was a lacewing larva, the aphid lion. Adrian watched, barely breathing, as the larva clamped its mandibles onto a fat aphid, draining it in seconds, tossing the empty husk aside and moving to the next. He looked closer at the aphid cluster. Scattered among the pale green pests were a few rigid, swollen brown husks. Mummies. Parasitic wasps had already injected their eggs into those aphids. The predators were here. The cavalry had arrived. Adrian dropped his hand from the radio. He let the leaf go. "Eat up, you ugly bastards," he whispered. But the relief was fleeting. Farming like this wasn't a static victory. It was a perpetual, terrifying tightrope walk. You couldn't control the outcome. You could only set the table and pray the right guests showed up. That night, Adrian sat on his porch in the dark. The only light came from the glowing cherry of his cigarette and the occasional flicker of a firefly in the tall grass. He drank cheap canned beer that tasted like aluminum. His back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The radio crackled from inside the kitchen window. The local agricultural report. Unseasonably dry conditions are expected to persist through the end of July. Agronomists are issuing early warnings for elevated pest pressure. Reports of western corn rootworm and a highly aggressive strain of spider mite are increasing in the southern counties. Farmers are advised to scout early and spray aggressively. Adrian took a drag of his cigarette. He looked out into the blackness of his fields. The hum of the insects had shifted to the nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs. Aggressive strain. He crushed the empty beer can in his hand. If a superpest came rolling through the valley, one that the chemicals down south had already failed to kill, his ladybugs and lacewings wouldn't be enough. He'd be wiped out. He went to sleep that night in the chair on the porch, his muddy boots still on, dreaming of yellow curling leaves and the deafening sound of chewing. The heat wave didn't break. It settled over the valley like a suffocating woolen blanket. By mid-July, the sky wasn't blue. It was a washed-out, hazy white. Dust hung in the air constantly, coating everything in a fine, gritty powder that ground between your teeth when you chewed. The plague didn't arrive with a dramatic swarm obscuring the sun. It came quietly, riding the hot wind. It started on a Tuesday. Adrian was down by the irrigation ditch, clearing a clog of algae with a rusted pitchfork, when he heard the drone. It was a heavy, thrumming sound, deeper than the usual hum of his fields. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the glare. A yellow biplane swooped low over the ridge, banking hard over Greg Miller's property. A thick, milky plume of chemical spray billowed from its wings, settling over the corn in a toxic fog. The wind caught the edge of the drift, and seconds later, Adrian smelled it. Sharp, chemical, smelling vaguely of burned plastic and garlic. Organophosphates. Adrian swore, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth. Greg was spraying midweek. He never sprayed midweek. Over the next 3 days, the crop dusters became a permanent fixture in the sky. The valley sounded like a war zone. The chemical smell grew so thick that Adrian's eyes watered constantly, and a persistent, dull headache pulsed at his temples. He drove into town for fuel on Friday. The mood at Holden's Feed and Seed had changed. The casual, loud banter was gone. A group of farmers stood in a tight circle near the register, their faces drawn, voices hushed and tense. "I hit 'em with lambda cyalothrin on Monday," a guy named Peterson was saying, his voice cracking. "Scouted yesterday. They're still there. It's like they drank it for breakfast. The leaves are looking like lace." "It's not just the mites," Greg Miller said. He looked terrible. His usually perfectly combed hair was a greasy mess under his cap, and he had dark circles under his eyes. "I got something boring into the stalks. Never seen it before. Stalks are just snapping in the wind, 50 acres down already." Adrian stood by the door, quiet. Greg looked up, spotting him. There was no snark this time. No Lord of the Flies jokes. Greg just looked at him, his eyes bloodshot. "You seen 'em, Art?" Greg asked. Adrian shifted his weight. "Seen what?" "The borers. The mites. They're chewing through the county. You gotta spray, man. If your weed patch breeds these things and sends them over my line, I swear to God." Greg didn't finish the threat. He just looked away, staring at the floor. Adrian bought his fuel and left. He drove back too fast, the truck rattling violently over the washboard dirt road. When he got home, he ran to his fields. He didn't walk. He ran, his boots kicking up clods of earth. He dropped to his knees in the middle of his bell pepper crop. He grabbed a plant, roughly turning the leaves over. There they were. They were tiny, almost microscopic, but the damage was undeniable. Fine, silky webbing stretched between the stems. The leaves were stippled with tiny yellow dots, losing their deep green color. Spider mites, and they were spreading fast. He ran to the corn he had planted on the north edge. He grabbed a stalk. At the base, a small pile of what looked like sawdust, frass, insect droppings. He took his pocket knife, sliced the stalk open, and found the creamy white caterpillar boring its way through the pith. The plague was here. Adrian's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick. He looked down the row. Hundreds of plants. Thousands. All vulnerable. The math played out in his head, cold and unforgiving. Without a harvest, he was bankrupt by November. He walked back to the barn. In the darkest corner, behind an old tarp, was a locked metal cabinet. He hadn't opened it in 5 years. He found the key on his ring, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it twice in the dust. He got it open. Inside sat a pristine, untouched gallon jug of broad-spectrum insecticide. It was highly illegal to keep without a current permit, highly toxic, and undeniably effective. A nuclear option. Adrian stared at the jug, The plastic was thick and white. The skull and crossbones on the label seemed to mock him. "Just do it," a voice in his head said. "Nobody will know. Save the farm. You tried it your way, and you failed. Don't lose your grandfather's land over pride." He reached out. His fingers brushed the cold plastic handle. He could smell the ghosts of the chemicals, the sharp, unnatural scent that promised sterile, dead control. He closed his eyes. He remembered the lacewing larvae, the earthworms, the hum of the field. If he sprayed this, everything died. The pests, yes, but also the ladybugs, the wasps, the soil fungi. He would turn his living dirt back into the dead, beige powder that Greg farmed. He would reset the clock to 0. Adrian gripped the handle of the jug. He pulled it off the shelf. It was heavy. He carried it out into the blinding sunlight, walking toward the brew tank. He set the jug of poison down on the grass. He stood there for a long time, the sweat rolling down his spine, soaking the waist of his jeans. He heard the distant, muffled roar of a crop duster over the ridge. They were fighting a war of annihilation out there. Adrian looked at the poison. Then he looked at the bubbling tank of compost tea. With a sudden, violent yell that tore at his throat, Adrian kicked the heavy plastic jug of insecticide. His steel-toed boot connected with a sickening thud. The jug went flying, hitting the side of the barn and cracking open. The clear, foul-smelling liquid spilled into the gravel, hissing slightly as it soaked into the dry rocks. Adrian stood panting, his chest heaving, staring at the spilled poison. He had burned his ships. There was no going back now. He turned toward the fields. "All right," he said aloud, his voice trembling but hard. "All right. It's just us." He went back into the barn, not to the chemical cabinet, but to the small refrigerator in the corner. He pulled out 3 small, insulated mesh bags he had received in the mail 2 days ago. He walked back out into the heat, the bags cool against his palms. He walked into the spider mite-infested peppers. He opened the first bag. Inside were thousands of Phytoceylus persimilis predatory mites. They were blind, fast, and aggressively carnivorous. They only ate other mites. If they ran out of food, they would eat each other. Adrian sprinkled the carrier material onto the leaves. "Go to work," he muttered. He moved to the corn. He opened a small vial of trichogramma wasps, microscopic stingers that laid their eggs inside the eggs of the stalk borers. He placed the cards on the stalks. It felt pathetic. A few bags of bugs against a biblical plague. As he walked back to the house, the yellowing leaves of his crop seemed to glare at him, a physical manifestation of his failure. The next week was agony. Adrian didn't sleep. He walked the rows at night with a flashlight, watching the pests multiply. The damage worsened. Leaves curled and browned. The edges of his fields started to look scorched. In town, the news was apocalyptic. The pesticides weren't working. The bugs were resistant. Greg Miller had lost 60% of his crop and was talking about plowing the rest under to claim insurance. The diner was silent, filled with men staring into coffee cups, calculating their ruin. Adrian stayed away. He couldn't bear the sympathetic looks, or worse, the "I told you so" smirks that would inevitably come when they saw his fields turning yellow too. On the 10th day after he released the predators, Adrian woke up to a strange sound. Silence. The wind had died down. But more than that, the frantic, buzzing energy of the valley felt altered. He pulled on his boots, his stomach knotted in a tight, painful ball, and walked out to the fields. He prepared himself for the sight of devastation. He expected to find his stalks snapped, his leaves skeletal. He walked to the pepper plants. He knelt. The yellow stippling was still there. The damage hadn't magically healed, but he didn't see the frantic movement of the spider mites. He squinted, leaning in close. The fine webbing was torn and ragged. Underneath the leaves, he saw them, the predatory mites. They were everywhere, fat and red, scurrying aggressively, but there were hardly any pest mites left to hunt. He ran to the corn. He sliced open a damaged stalk. The borer caterpillar inside was dead, its body blackened and liquefied. A nematode had gotten it. He checked the eggs on the leaves. They were all black. The parasitic wasps had done their job. Adrian sat back on his heels in the dirt. He dug his hands into the soil. It was still damp beneath the mulch. It still smelled like life. His crops looked battered. They looked ragged, chewed on. and exhausted. But they were standing. They were green. He looked across the creek, over toward Greg's massive acreage. The sun was coming up, illuminating the valley. Greg's fields were brown, a vast, unbroken sea of dead, brittle stalks, poisoned and eaten alive. Adrian looked back at his own messy, weed-filled, unglamorous farm. A single ladybug crawled over his knuckles. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and for the first time in months, he smiled. August broke the heat wave with a violent, 3-day thunderstorm that turned the dust to grease, but the water came too late for the rest of the valley. When the skies finally cleared, the air pressure shifted, leaving behind a crisp, biting chill in the mornings. It was harvest season. In a normal year, this was the loud time. The valley would echo with the mechanical roar of diesel engines, the metallic clanking of grain carts, and the blinding stadium lights of combines working through the midnight hours. The air usually smelled of diesel exhaust, sweet corn dust, and money. This year, the valley was quiet, a suffocating, hollow silence. Adrian stood at the edge of his Roma tomato field, holding a plastic 5-gallon bucket. The handle was cracked, pinching the calluses on his palm. His back was a solid block of dull, vibrating pain. He'd been picking since 4 in the morning, working by the beam of a headlamp until the sun crested the ridge. He bent down, the damp denim of his jeans clinging to his knees. The smell of the tomato plants was overpowering that sharp, resinous green scent that stuck to the fine hairs on his arms and stained his fingertips black. He reached into the dense foliage, his hand finding the heavy, smooth curve of a ripe Roma. It wasn't perfect. There was a thin brown scar near the stem where a beetle had taken a test bite weeks ago, and a slight asymmetry to the bottom. A grocery store chain would have rejected it for not looking like it was molded out of red plastic, but it was dense, heavy like a water balloon. When Adrian pressed his thumb against the skin, it yielded just enough, promising thick, rich flesh inside. He tossed it into the bucket. Thud. He picked another and another, moving down the row with a robotic, punishing rhythm. Beside him, the cover crop of buckwheat had died back, forming a thick, damp mat over the soil, locking the moisture in. When his boots shifted, he could smell the earthy, fungal decay of the mulch breaking down. By noon, his flatbed truck was sagging on its rear suspension, loaded with stacked wooden crates of tomatoes and bell peppers. His corn, the rows that had survived the borers thanks to the parasitic wasps, stood tall, the ears thick and heavy, waiting for the picker. Adrian wiped his face with a greasy rag, leaving a streak of dirt across his cheekbone. He climbed into the cab of the Ford. The vinyl seat was scorching hot. He turned the key, the engine rattling to life, and put it in gear, the transmission whining as he slowly navigated the rutted dirt road toward the county highway. As he drove past Greg Miller's property, Adrian slowed down. He couldn't help it. It looked like a wildfire had swept through, only without the cleansing black ash. Greg's cornstalks were a sickly, bleached gray. They were folded over, snapped at the midsections where the borers had hollowed them out. The spider mites had sucked the last bit of life from the leaves, leaving them brittle and translucent, shivering in the breeze like dead skin. The smell blowing through Adrian's open window was foul, a sour, fermenting rot of dead plant matter that had no healthy soil microbes to break it down properly. It was the smell of bankruptcy. Adrian hit the gas, looking away, his stomach tight. There was no joy in being right, no vindication, just a heavy, sickening survivor's guilt that tasted like copper in his mouth. He arrived at the local processing cannery just outside of town. The massive concrete lot, usually a chaotic traffic jam of idling semi-trucks and screaming foremen during harvest week, was mostly empty. 3 pickup trucks sat near the weighing scales. Adrian pulled onto the industrial scale, put the truck in park, and stepped out. Harris, the procurement manager, walked out of the corrugated metal office holding a clipboard. Harris was a chronically stressed man who lived on antacids and black coffee, but today, he just looked hollow. Harris looked at the sagging bed of Adrian's truck, then back at Adrian. He pushed his hard hat back on his balding head. "Jesus, Artie," Harris breathed. The scent of ripe tomatoes wafted off the flatbed, cutting through the smell of hot asphalt. "I heard you didn't spray." "I didn't," Adrian said, His voice was flat. He didn't have the energy to explain the predatory mites or the compost tea. Harris walked to the back of the truck, pulling a pepper from the top crate. He inspected it, turning it over in his hands. They got a little cosmetic damage. Scarring on the skins. You're canning them, Harris, not putting them in a beauty pageant, Adrian said, crossing his arms. Harris sighed, tossing the pepper back. Yeah, we are. I'm taking everything you got. The big boys down south, they got wiped. Peterson yielded 10 bushels an acre, complete loss. We're paying premium just to keep the canning lines running this week. Adrian felt a sudden sharp spike in his chest. A premium. He did the math in his head, staring at the concrete. It was enough. It was more than enough. The bank wouldn't take the tractor. They wouldn't take the land. He could breathe. Pull around to Dock 4, Harris said, scribbling on the clipboard. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. You're the only green thing in a 20-mile radius, Adrian. You know that, right? They're talking about you at the diner. I don't care what they're talking about, Adrian said. He climbed back into the truck and slammed the door. It took 2 hours to unload the crates. The physical labor was a relief, a mindless repetition of lifting and stacking that kept his brain from spinning. When he finally walked into the office to get his check, the small room was air-conditioned to the point of freezing. He stood at the counter, waiting for the clerk to print the invoice. The door opened behind him. The heavy, dragging footsteps stopped. Adrian didn't turn around, but he smelled the familiar mix of expensive cologne and stale sweat. Hey, Art. Adrian closed his eyes for a second. He turned. Greg Miller stood in the doorway. He looked 10 years older than he had in June. The confident, booming swagger was entirely gone. His shoulders slumped, and his usually pristine denim jacket was stained and rumpled. He held a small, crumpled envelope in his hand. Crop insurance paperwork. The clerk handed Adrian a sealed envelope. Adrian took it, sliding it into his back pocket. Greg, Adrian said. The silence in the small office stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed deafening. Greg looked at Adrian's mud-caked boots, then at his dirt-stained hands. He didn't look at Adrian's face. I'm hauling my tractors to the auction block in Tulsa next Tuesday, Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a statement of fact, stripped of any emotion. It was the sound of a man who had already bled out and was just waiting for the heart to stop pumping. Adrian's jaw tightened. He thought about the jokes, the Lord of the Flies comments, the threat of calling the co-op inspector. He thought about the rage he had felt all summer. But, looking at the broken man in front of him, the anger evaporated, leaving nothing but a profound, exhausting sadness. I'm sorry, Greg, Adrian said, and he meant it. He hated Greg's methods. He hated his arrogance, but he didn't hate the man. Nobody deserved to lose their family's dirt. Greg nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the floor. Yeah, me too. Adrian walked past him, stepping out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat of the asphalt radiated through the soles of his boots. He got into his empty truck, the suspension sitting high and stiff now, and drove home. He didn't turn the radio on. He just listened to the rattling of the empty flatbed and the grinding of the tires against the pavement, heading back toward the only living soil left in the valley. By late November, the valley had surrendered to the cold. The mornings were shrouded in a thick, gray, freezing fog that clung to the barren fields like cobwebs. The earth hardened overnight, freezing solid, only to thaw into a slick, treacherous mud by midday. Adrian sat at his kitchen table. The house was quiet, save for the violent hissing of the cast-iron radiator in the corner. The air inside smelled of stale Robusta coffee, damp wool, and wood smoke. Spread out on the scarred oak table were his ledger, a stack of heavily creased invoices, and his checkbook. He held a cheap ballpoint pen, the plastic casing cracked from where he'd aggressively chewed on it over the past 3 months. He drew a heavy, dark line under the final column of numbers. He was in the black. Barely. After paying the back-due mortgage installments, replacing a cracked belt on the combine, and buying seed for the winter rye cover crop, the remaining margin was pitifully thin. He couldn't afford a new truck. He couldn't afford to remodel the drafty kitchen that let the winter wind whistle through the window frames. But the bank envelope sitting on the edge of the table was a standard monthly statement, not a foreclosure notice. Adrian leaned back, the wooden chair creaking in protest, and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that 10 hours of sleep couldn't fix. He had won, technically, but farming wasn't a war you won, it was a siege you survived. Come spring, the pests would return. The weather would be unpredictable. The tightrope walk would begin all over again. He stood up, grabbing his heavy canvas coat off the back of the door, and walked out onto the porch. The air was bitterly cold, instantly stinging his lungs as he inhaled. His fields were a muted, dormant green, the winter rye he had drilled into the soil after harvest had germinated, covering the earth like a shaggy, unkempt rug. It protected the topsoil from the harsh winter winds and fed the microbial life below the frost line. A flash of chrome caught his eye down by the county road. A truck was turning onto his long, dirt driveway. It was a King Ranch Ford F-250, Greg Miller's truck. Adrian stayed on the porch, his bare hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He watched as the heavy truck navigated the frozen ruts, finally coming to a stop near the barn. The engine cut off. Greg stepped out. He wasn't wearing his usual pristine leather boots. He wore heavy rubber muck boots, coated in gray, dried clay. He zipped his jacket up to his chin against the biting wind and walked slowly toward the porch. "Morning, Art," Greg said, stopping at the bottom of the wooden steps, his breath plumed in the freezing air. "Greg." Adrian didn't move. "Thought you were in Tulsa." "Sold the big deer. Sold the satellite rig," Greg said, his voice completely flat, devoid of its usual booming cadence. He looked out over Adrian's fields, staring at the low-lying winter rye. "Bank let me keep the house and 100 acres. Liquidated the rest to cover the seed and chemical debt from the summer." Adrian nodded slowly. 100 acres was nothing to a guy who used to farm 3,000. It was a devastating humiliation. "That's rough, Greg. Insurance adjuster screwed me. Said the crop failure was due to unforeseen biological mutation, not weather. Payout was a fraction of the policy." Greg kicked at a frozen clod of dirt near the bottom step. He kept his eyes on the ground. There was a desperate, tight tension in his jaw. Greg finally looked up. He pointed a thick, gloved finger toward Adrian's field. "What is that?" "Winter rye," Adrian said. "And hairy vetch. Why?" "Roots keep the soil from blowing away in the winter wind," Adrian said. "When I terminate it in the spring, it feeds the worms. The worms feed the plants." Greg stared at the green field. "My dirt is just dust, Art. The frost heaved it up, and the wind is blowing it halfway to the county line. There's nothing holding it together." Adrian stepped off the porch. He walked past Greg, heading toward the barn, and grabbed a long-handled spade. He walked out into the nearest field. Greg hesitated, then followed, his rubber boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. Adrian drove the spade into the earth with the heavy heel of his boot. The top inch was frozen, but beneath that, the blade sank easily. He leveraged the handle back, popping a massive, dark chunk of soil out of the ground. He picked up the clod in his bare hands and held it out. "Take off your glove," Adrian said. Greg slowly pulled off his leather work glove. "Squeeze it," Adrian commanded gently. Greg pressed his fingers into the soil. It didn't crumble into dust. It held its shape, spongy and dark. A faint smell of deep woods and damp leaves rose from it, cutting through the freezing cold. Embedded in the dark loam were the white, thread-like roots of the rye, and as the dirt broke apart slightly, a fat earthworm was exposed, curled in a tight knot against the chill. "It's alive," Greg whispered, staring at his palm. "It's a sponge, Greg," Adrian said, his voice dropping the defensive edge it had carried all year. "You've been treating your soil like it's just a cup to hold your chemicals, but it's an immune system. You sterilized it." Greg didn't argue. He didn't scoff. He just kept rubbing his thumb over the dark, crumbly texture. "I got 100 acres, Art," Greg said, his voice cracking slightly. "It's all dead. How do I fix it?" Adrian looked at his neighbor. He thought about turning his back and walking inside. It would be easy. But Adrian looked down at the dark, living soil scattered across Greg's boots. The dirt didn't care about their feuds. Adrian let out a long, slow breath, a cloud of white vapor in the freezing air. "It takes time. It takes a lot of rotting, ugly work, Adrian said. Next week, I'm ordering cover crop seed for the spring. Clover and tillage radish. I can order double. If you've got the cash to pay for your half. Greg stared at Adrian for a long time. He clenched his fist, feeling the grit against his bare palm. I got the cash, Greg said. Adrian nodded. All right then, we'll start with the dirt. In the end, Adrian didn't conquer nature. He surrendered to it, letting the quiet, unseen battles beneath the soil win the war above. It's a messy, terrifying way to farm and to live, but maybe survival isn't about control. Maybe it's about connection. What do you think about Adrian and Greg's fragile truce? Could you put your pride aside to learn from the guy you laughed at? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, hit like, share with a friend, and subscribe for more raw, real storytelling. Catch you on the next one.